Before I start this talk, the edge at your fingertips, literally, I'd like to tell a story that probably nobody here asked for, but I'll still go ahead to tell it. So yesterday, I was preparing this talk, and I was on a phone with a friend, and we're just having a random conversation. And then I told him that, hey, I'm giving a talk tomorrow. And he was like, oh, what's your talk about? And I said, the edge at your fingertips. And then I showed him this slide. And the first question he goes on to ask me is, hey, Gift, what's the edge, right? And I'm like, to give you context, this person is not a developer. So, of course, it's OK to ask that question. He's a designer. And then we went on 20 minutes conversation about what the edge is. And that just rings for me that maybe so many people don't know what the edge is or are not familiar with that term. So I just decided that I think it was like a good primer for me to have the conversation with him coming into this talk, because my talk is exactly about the edge, what it is, how to build your applications and deploy it to the edge. In this talk, we're going to cover a few key points. First, like I said, I'm going to talk to you about the edge. So, of course, it would be nice to start off with what the edge is. I would also go over what the differences is between serverless functions and edge functions, because, it might be confusing for some folks. What are the differences? Like, why should I even bother to be concerned about the edge, right, if you don't really know what the differences are? And then I'm going to go over some pros and cons of serverless and edge functions. And because, of course, it will be remiss of me to not talk about Cloudflare here, I'm also going to share with you Cloudflare's developer platform and our offerings for building applications on the edge. Finally, share with you some examples and use cases of applications you can build on the edge. So yeah, Gifts. I currently work as a developer advocate at Cloudflare. I also like to call myself a developer educator. And this is because I'm very passionate about sharing my knowledge with people, especially folks that are trying to get into the industry. I'm also a YouTuber. And this is a shameless plug, but if you'd like to find some of my stuff on YouTube, you can also check me out there. Anyway, what's the edge, right? This is super, easy to ask anybody when they see this talk, and I'm just going to go on to ask here, if you know what the edge is. Can I see, show of hands? Oh, okay. Okay. Yeah, actually, while I was rehearsing this, I thought everybody would have their hands up, and then I'll be like, okay, my work here is done. I can as well leave. But yeah, I'm happy that that's not the case. I'll say maybe 30% of the audience knows, have an idea of what I'm going to be talking about, but at least this is going to be an introduction for you to learn more about the edge. So yeah, the edge, what is it? This is my definition of the edge, and if you ask me, I would go on to say the edge is a server that's geographically located close to your users, right? And this is very vague, right, for now, but as we go on throughout the course of this talk, it will make more sense to you. This image right here on screen, it's currently Cloudflare's edge network distributed across the globe, right? All the blue dots you see on this map shows you our data centers located across the world. Right now, we have over 270, co-locations across the world, and essentially what this means is you can deploy your code. These are actually CDNs and edge servers, meaning that you can deploy your code anywhere. You can deploy your code on Cloudflare's edge network, and your users can access it from anywhere in the world, because, of course, we have servers located in almost all of the continents. Before I get into more of edge functions and all the good stuff about it, also limitations, of course, I would like to go back to where it all started, how are we here right now? Because the thing with technology is it evolves, right? So it's probably started somewhere. And for me, that's here, right? Obviously not for me, but for people, because I don't remember having my own server. But maybe some people here did. So if you had, can I see, raise of hands, if you had this, maybe recently, I think people still do this, like maintain their own servers. So I kind of find that a lot of people are moving away from traditional servers. So traditional servers here means that you own your own server, you're managing it yourself, you scale it yourself, right? But it comes with its own limitations, right? And limitations could be that first, it's expensive to maintain. So imagine that you, as a sole developer, have a server at home, and then you're probably hosting a couple of websites there, and one day you wake up to like 1 million requests on one of your sites, right? You have to think about how to scale it to accommodate that much request. All of this work, you have to write the code, you have to think about managing your server. It's just a lot, right? But there are services that, like I said, the world has evolved, so there are services that allow you to, offset that amount of work somewhere else, and that's where I'm getting to. Another limitation of using traditional servers is it has high latency due to the large amount of traffic. Like I just mentioned here, that in a situation where you have a large number of traffic coming to your website, of course, if you don't have enough memory on your server, it could cause high latencies for your users trying to access that website or application that you've built. And finally, limited opportunity for scaling. Everything still ties back to you maintaining your server yourself because, of course, it's hard to maintain, it's hard to scale when you want to. So all of this, I find, are limitations with traditional, servers. And that's why we've moved from that over the past couple of years, I would say a decade probably, to what we now see called serverless functions. Again, I'm just going to be doing this throughout just to gauge how people are getting what I'm saying if you have used serverless functions. Can I see hands? Okay, impressive. Okay, nice. Yeah, so serverless functions, does it really mean that there are no servers? No. There are still servers, right? Serverless function essentially is that you are offsetting the time management of owning your own servers to other cloud providers. And for me, that's some of this. This is not all the cloud providers out there, but essentially hosting your code or your application, not by yourself, but on other cloud providers that can help you manage your code. And all you now need to do is focus on actually writing your code. You don't have to think about scaling. You don't have to think about maintaining your server and all of that. And the most interesting bit here for me is with serverless functions, you only pay for what you use, right? We'll go over some advantages of serverless functions. I'm pretty sure most of you already know this, but again, the same thing. You don't get to host it yourself. It's being hosted by a provider. Low cost of bandwidth means that you only pay for what you use. And in contrast to a traditional server, you have to purchase all the servers. You have to have it up and running, regardless of if it's being used or not. But on the other hand, with serverless functions, you only pay for the requests that your application is making. And moving on, scalability on demand, again, comes with serverless functions because you can scale as much as possible when you're building or when you have your sites or application hosted on a serverless provider. Again, without me spoiling it for you, I know that with every good thing comes limitations, right? So serverless functions currently also have its own limitation. And again, bear with me that this highly depends on your use case. The first here I have is all your functions are stored in a centralized core location. So the idea with serverless is, you don't have to host it yourself, but it's being hosted by a provider that hosts it in a core location. And for example, that could be US East or US West, for example. Now, the limitation here is, imagine I am in Amsterdam right now, and I hosted my application in the US, and I have someone from Africa, for example, Lagos. I'm from Lagos, trying to access that website. They are going to experience latency because, of course, where your site is hosted from your users is, worlds apart, I would say. So that's one limitation. When you have so many of your users coming from a different geographical location, and your server is hosted somewhere too far from them, of course they will experience, slow times to load their page, or they will also experience latency. Another thing that is core, or one problem people see with serverless function, is the cold start problem. Essentially, what a cold start is the time it takes for your function to boot up after it's been idle for a while. So remember I mentioned that serverless functions are not up and, like your function when deployed to a cloud provider is not always up and running, right? So imagine you have a function deployed that has not been triggered for a few weeks or a month, and you trigger it again by maybe making a request to the function or whatever. It takes like a few minutes to start up because, of course, the process for it to allocate resources to the function and get it running back up, that could vary depending on what kind of application it is, right? But this is a problem. It has cold starts when you're trying to, rewake. Maybe that's not a good word, when you're trying to bring up your server when it's already idle. Lastly, it has also limited execution time. Now, depends on the provider you are using, but sometimes functions also have a limit to how long they can run. The most common one that I've seen is 10 milliseconds. So if you have a function, normally your function should do just one thing and only one thing only, but if you have a function that runs multiple things, and you end up having like the execution time go over like 10 milliseconds, is always going to fail. Of course, the solution here is to probably upgrade your plan with the provider to have more extended execution time. But really, if you find that you're maybe building like a small project and you're already exceeding 10 milliseconds, then there's a problem. And maybe that's not a good use case for the application you're trying to build. And that brings us to edge functions, right? Edge functions, exactly what are they? I mentioned earlier that they are servers that are located closer to your users. Are they really different from serverless functions? Not really. Edge functions, like I like to call it, are serverless functions on the edge. They are deployed on the edge. And we established already that the edge is anywhere your users are. The edge is region X, meaning that, given the context of my previous example about hosting like a website in the US and having someone request it from Nigeria, for example, now you don't have that problem with edge functions, because what happens when you deploy on the edge is your function is duplicated into several copies and is then deployed on all the locations that your provider, in this case, has. For Cloudflare, that's 270 cities across the world, meaning that if you have someone trying to request their application from anywhere in the world, they don't also have like latency or slow load times or any of the initial problem you had with serverless functions. There are so many edge providers out there. It means for me to say we have Cloudflare Workers, which is Cloudflare's edge function provider. We have AWS Lambda as edge, Dino Deploy, Netlify functions, and so many more other edge functions provided that you can as well look into and use. What are some advantages of edge functions? First, of course, the main character here is you have reduced latency, meaning that, going back to my example, your application or your function or your backend code is deployed across several regions, meaning that for someone to request your site, or for you to have a user trying to use your site, they don't experience latency, because, of course, this problem is solved with edge functions, zero cold starts. And this is also another big thing. With serverless functions, we had the problem where it takes a bit of time for your functions to load after it's been idle for a while, but you don't have that problem with edge functions. And I'm going to explain how at Cloudflare we've solved this problem later on in the slide. And of course, you also have improved application performance, because when your site is fast, there is like limited memory being used, your application performance is also improved. again, with every good thing, there comes like limitations. And for edge functions, some limitations you could get could be limited compute resources, right? Again, really depends on the provider and what your use case is, so what you're trying to build. But again, you have like a limited amount of CPU allocated to you to run your function. And the moment you exceed that, that could easily cause your function to, fail. 1 minute, please. I need to have water. That's fine. Okay. Yeah. Yeah, going back to what I was saying, you have one limitation, which is limited compute resources when you're building, or when you're building on the edge as well, because of course, most providers have a limit to how much compute resources you can use to run your edge functions. This is also one big thing about edge functions, and I think there is currently already like a way to solve it. At least the community is already thinking about it, but depending on the provider that you go with, most of them are using different runtimes. For example, Cloudflare uses Workers runtime, Dino uses Dino runtime. You also have the Node.js runtime being used by some providers. Now, the problem with this is that there is no, support for browsers functionality in like some of these different runtimes. For example, at Cloudflare, we have some of our packages and libraries that are supported by our Cloudflare runtime that you probably will not be able to use in a Node.js runtime. Now, the problem here is you can't really move your application, because if you think about an edge worker or an edge function, is literally a JavaScript file, right, that you're writing. So the problem here is you can't really move across from a platform to another. This is like a problem, vendor lock-in as well, because the APIs that we support is different from what maybe Dino supports or Node.js supports and all of that. So we even have here, we even have our own libraries that you use to build, applications on Cloudflare Workers. But this is a problem, right? We want to be able to we want all runtimes, or regardless of where you're building, we want everybody to be able to use browser APIs, naturally without having to think of, oh, if I'm moving away from this, I have to rewrite my entire code. That's not what we want. So Cloudflare alongside Dino, Node.js, and a couple of other communities have come together to create something called Winter CG. So it's basically a community that come together to make sure that the web or the APIs that we use for building our different runtimes is at least aligned and similar, so that at the end of the day, you as a user trying to use Workers, you can as well go on to use the same APIs across other runtimes. So this is something that was recently announced by Cloudflare along these other communities that I mentioned. So this is a limitation right now, but maybe in a few months or so, it might not be. On the left-hand side, I have some of the APIs there that's currently supported by all of this runtime, Node, Dino, and Cloudflare Workers. Lastly, limitation number 3 is high latency due to data storage limitation. Another problem here with edge functions, I mean, I love it, I'm sharing it with you, but I'm also being honest and saying that if you're going to be using it, make sure you have this in mind. If you're going to be building your functions on the edge, you should also know that there's problems with data, managing data. Yes, your function is deployed everywhere so anybody can access it, but what about your database, right? So the problem right now is, there are providers that already have solution for this and working on solution for this, but the problem here is once you have your functions deployed everywhere and you still have your database in, for example, US East, Now, somebody trying to load data on your website will still experience latency because, of course, your database is hosted somewhere else, right? That's one problem, data latency. Moving on, how does Cloudflare solve everything, or how does Cloudflare give you opportunity to build on the edge? We currently have a lot of tools and applications that would help you build your application on the edge, and I'm happy to share some of them with you. Maybe you're already familiar with them, but feel free to come ask me questions later about any of them when I share them. But I'll go over some of them. We have Cloudflare Workers, which is our serverless function provider, which is how we build functions on the edge. We also have several different products that would help you, put data on the edge, so help you save data on the edge. I'll just go over some of them, because this is not a depiction of everything we have. First, Cloudflare Workers. Cloudflare Workers is our serverless execution environment that allows you to, build functions without having to manage infrastructure. With Cloudflare Functions, or with Cloudflare Worker, you have zero code start. And the good thing here is, with zero code start, your application is always up. You don't have delays when you try to load it. And how are you able to solve this problem? I'll just breeze through it quickly. So we found that there is a problem when you have your site hosted, but of course you've not, requested, nobody has requested it for a while, and now it's I do. And that's something you find with serverless functions. But we thought about solving this problem, and the way we solved it is, before any request is made to the server, there's of course the TLS handshake, right? This happens when the client is trying to communicate to the server and then back to the client to make sure that they have, communication, and that they agree on, their encryption keys and all of that before the actual request is made. Now, what Cloudflare did was, while the TLS handshake is going on, so when the client tries to make a request to the server before the actual request is, made, during this process, Cloudflare would run, at least start up the worker's runtime so that they can warm up the function. So you basically have something going on behind the scene, right, before your function actually starts running. And how this helps with zero runtime or zero code start is, before your function, before your client requests the function from the server, it's already warm up all the resources and things that you would require for your function to start running, meaning that it takes the initial load time for us, which is 5 milliseconds, to 0 milliseconds, because of course the function was already boot up behind the scenes. Another interesting bit about Cloudflare Workers is cost savings. We have 100,000 requests for free, right? So you can make as much as 100,000 requests daily. And then if you want to scale up above this, it's also possible because we have affordable prices for you to use. We also solve the problem of storage on the edge with a suite of products that we currently have. So we have KV, which is a key value store for saving data on the edge. We have durable objects. We have R2, and recently D1. I'm going to walk you through some of these data solutions so you see how they work. How does Cloudflare Workers work? Because I mentioned earlier that we don't use Node.js runtime. We don't use Dino runtime, but we have our own Workers runtime. And the underlying technology here that Cloudflare Worker uses is, we use something called V8 isolate engine. What is this V8 isolate engine? One thing you should know is all of the runtimes, all of them are being built on top of the V8 engine, but how does this make any difference between Node.js and ours runtime? So typically with serverless functions, you have them running in a virtual machine. But we have something called an isolate model, and I would walk through the differences between running your code or your function in a virtual machine and running it using the isolate model. So with a virtual machine, of course, it's like a software that exists within another computer. With V8 isolate, you have isolates that are lightweight context and are grouped variables with the code allowed to mutate by them. I think the core thing here to know about virtual machines and the V8 isolate engine is one of them consumes lesser memory than the other. So virtual machines consume more memory when you're trying to build your functions on it. Compared to V8 isolate, it consumes less memory. It also has slower load time, so you can get your workers running already in less than 5 milliseconds, and even better, in 0 milliseconds, because we already solved the problem of cold starts. This is an example worker. So just so you know, a worker is a JavaScript, or if you're going to be using TypeScript, a TypeScript file. This essentially is a function that returns hello worker. This is our syntax for writing Cloudflare workers or serverless functions. To add to this about serverless functions, edge functions, we have another product that also helps solve this for you. How many of you here are familiar with Cloudflare pages? Oh, okay. Yeah, we're getting there. We're getting there. Cloudflare pages is a platform that allows you to deploy your sites, whether it's static, JAMstack, to one of Cloudflare's edge network. Now, we've seen that many people are deploying their static sites using Cloudflare pages, and when they need to add dynamic functionality to their pages, they have to also spin up a worker. So right now, if you're trying to have a dynamic website, you have to have a Cloudflare pages application, and you also have to have a workers application. We then went ahead to think of a better way to merge these two, so people just have like one application, and that's bettered pages function. So Cloudflare pages function here is a way for you to build full stack application by executing code on Cloudflare's network using Cloudflare workers. This is an example of a function. This also does the same thing like the previous code I showed you, but the difference here is a lot of things are abstracted from Cloudflare workers so you can build them directly on pages. And to get it working in your Cloudflare pages project, you just need to add a new directory called functions, and in there you can write your Cloudflare functions or edge functions in this case. How are we solving the storage problem on the edge? Like I mentioned, there are currently so many different providers out there, but the underlying problem still is how do you get your database close to your users? Edge functions are cool. I really like this tweet by Sam. Edge functions are cool, but your database is probably in US East 1 or US East 2. So it's still a problem that everybody has right now, that your functions is deployed everywhere, but your database is in one location. At Cloudflare, we have a couple of products that allows you at least solve this problem, because right now it's still like a limitation, right? We have Workers KV, which is a global key value store that allows you to cache your data on the edge. So in this case, if you're building an application, this can allow you cache some part of that data on the edge by helping you store your data in like key value items. For example, you can have data distributed across different locations that is cached and can be used in your application. But the downside here is this is perfect for when you have read items, like you have to read to the database, or compared to when you have to write to it. And the thing is, with KV is good for some use cases, but it depends on exactly what you are using or what you're trying to do with it. Now we have the syntax for writing to KV. You can put data using the put method. You can get data using the get method, delete method, the list method to list all of your data from KV. So the good thing here is you have at least your data cached to databases or to edge servers across the world, which partly solves the problem of data on the edge. We've also gone forward to even innovate a new product called, not new, but at least still new, I would say, durable objects. What are durable objects? Durable objects provides you low latency coordination and consistent storage for the Workers platform. With KV that I mentioned, of course, it's great. It helps you, save your data, cache it on Cloudflare's edge network. But those data, of course, they don't have any states. The moment you have to do something with states, then they are stateless data that you're storing. But the moment you have to do something that has to do with states, then you're a bit stranded because, of course, that doesn't solve the problem for you. And that's why we have durable objects. Durable objects is stateful data on the edge. We have a demo project that shows you how this works. This is just an example. So we have a chat app that has, durable objects working under the hood. The good thing here is all the data is consistent because it's being cached, and also a chat app requires you to send a message to somebody, get it back, send a message to somebody, get it back with at least very low latency. And with durable object, this is a use case for you to use it because, of course, it helps with the problem of saving states on the edge. A durable object also has a similar syntax to Cloudflare Workers. A durable object is basically a JavaScript class object that has the durable object as a constructor inside the class and also has a worker script as well inside the durable object. So if you're trying to create a durable object in Cloudflare, this is an example syntax of how it would look like. R2 is one of our other products, and R2 is storage for assets. It's storage for images. You can also use it to store smaller assets. R2 storage allows developers to store large amounts of unstructured data without the costly egress bandwidth fees associated with typical cloud storage providers. And R2, the way it works is you have buckets where you can store static files, and it's being cached across all of our global edge networks as well. And then you have it ingrained in your workers in case you want to use it inside of your functions or just have it. And essentially how this works is you have images or unstructured data stored on the cloud, and it's accessible across all the edge servers that we have. Another data storage solution that we also recently announced is called D1, and this is our first SQL database. So we've gone ahead to create all of these services to actually help with the problem of storing data on the edge. Some of this might fit your use case if you're thinking of building edge solutions or building your full stack application on the edge. What are some common use cases for building on the edge? I know I've walked you through, this is the edge, these are some of the things you can do with it, but really what are some use cases that would be good for building on the edge? The first one here I have is geolocation-based redirects. Now, the good thing here is with edge functions, you have access to your user's location, right? So if I am visiting a website that's hosted on the edge, they obviously know where I'm visiting it from because my location or where I'm getting my data from is the current server located in that city. So if you have an application that you want to redirect your users based on where they are visiting the site from, one use case that could help you do that is an edge function, because you have access to the user's location to easily redirect them. A/B testing is also another good use case. So you can A/B test your application. Say you have an app that just released a new feature, but you want to test it for a portion of your users. Cloudflare Workers is also a good, platform for you to do that. Custom HTTP headers and cookie management would also be a good use case if you're thinking about, building functions on the edge. Of course, user authentication and authorization is another good use case, and localization and personalization, because in this case, you have context of where your users are visiting from. Now, I'll walk through all the use cases that are good for building on Cloudflare Workers, but when should you actually not build on Cloudflare Workers, right? I'm right here telling you, Cloudflare Workers is good, yeah, go build on it, but when should you not think about doing that? Well, I'm just kidding. You should definitely build on Cloudflare Workers, right? But to be serious, I think it still depends on the data problem that I mentioned before. So if you have a database that is hosted somewhere else but not on the edge, you will still experience latency. Of course, the idea with edge functions is to help you solve latency, so help your users get access to the code or backend functions that you've deployed, but the moment you have your database hosted somewhere else, that's still a problem, right? You still have latency problems. And another use case that I wouldn't recommend is if you have a function that exceeds the limited amount of resources that you should be using. So widely depends on the kind of use case that you're using. So maybe before you go on to say, I want to build this thing, then you think about these two things. Of course, I know that there are several other use cases that might not be recommended based on people's experiences. So I'm happy to hear that maybe you've tried to do something and you find that it's not, the right solution for you at the moment. I would like to hear that maybe after, if you want to chat with me. Now I talked about some few use cases. I'll show you some examples of them and how you can use Cloudflare Workers to build them. So geolocation-based redirects, like I mentioned earlier, with you building on Cloudflare Workers, you have access to your user's location. So a good use case here would be probably to redirect them when they try to visit your site. For example, I live here in the Netherlands, so I'm trying to access ASOS.com, and with geolocation redirect, I can get the context of where the user is visiting from and use the response to redirect them to the correct URL, which in this case has NL behind it. That's one use case. And another is, this is me just trying to do a demo of redirecting someone somewhere else. Another use case here is you can try to log failed response using workers. And this is an example of I have an application, right? And what I want to do is when there is a 503 error, I don't want to stop them there. I want to retry the request and see if the response returns 200, and if it does, actually move on with my application or the function that I'm trying to run. So this is that example right here where I have of course, this is a stopped response. So I'm checking if I get a 503. If I don't get that, then return. If I get a 503, retry the response, and then until I get the 200, then I can move forward. And finally, one last example I'd like to share with you is A/B testing remote origins on Cloudflare Workers. A good use case here is if you have a new feature on your website that you're trying to test, out there with real users. In this case, you can create A/B testing with workers to only share a specific URL in this case, maybe the new feature that you're trying to test with a portion of your users. So this is an example. Here I have two URLs. I have cloudflare.com and JSWORLD Conference. And then I'm splitting the request. So I'm saying, create a random number and split this request between the first origin and the second origin. And essentially what happens here is when I go to my worker, the URL that returns when I run the code, for every new request that I make, I get a random page. So I either get JSWORLD Conference website or I get cloudflare.com. So that's an example of how you can use A/B testing on Cloudflare workers. So to wrap up, what did we cover today? I went over what the edge is, how it's different from serverless functions, pros and cons of using serverless functions over edge functions. I talked about Cloudflare's developer platform. We have workers, KVR2, durable objects, and D1. And then I showed you some examples of edge functions. I'll close off my talk with this thought that I had. I feel like building applications on the edge would help you would bring you closer to your end users, and in this case, improve their experience and also make the web more accessible because, of course, your application is accessible to everybody without latency or low or bad performance. Well, thank you. I have a few resources here in case you're interested in learning more about Cloudflare. You can check it out or scan the QR code to get the slides. Thank you so much.